Hello and welcome back. This is part 2 of the week 7 lecture. So another thing I want to mention just to give you a little more cultural context for the time period very quickly, because this of course matters for the novel. There's something that's often referred to as the Indian question. Not a very elegant way of phrasing it, but that's what it's often referred to by historians, and in some cases that's what it was referred to during the time period. But basically it was this larger debate, a sort of national debate that played out in political venues, but it also, showed up in literature. It was talked about in taverns, on the street, in households. But the basic gist of it is, what are we going to do with Native Americans? As expansion continued, as white settlers pushed further and further west and displaced more and more Native American groups, there was this question that emerged, like, what are we going to do to assimilate the Native Americans who remain alive, but no longer, can practice their traditional way of life? So again, there was a lot of racism involved in this debate. A lot of people thought, we don't really need to do anything. Let's just get rid of them. Other people just didn't care. It was not like everybody was really, or even most Americans at the time were really concerned or compassionate towards Native Americans, though some were. And there were advocates for Native Americans. There were people who were sort of arguing that we should halt expansion because we were exacting a terrible toll on the native population. But there were also just practical concerns, especially in the East. So remember, we're pushing west throughout the early 1800s, and we're also acquiring a bunch of new territory. With the Louisiana Purchase and then subsequent developments, our country is growing rapidly. And a lot of this new land that we're acquiring, we haven't explored it yet. We're a little bit like Cabeza de Vaca and those early Spaniards. We view all of this as ours, just like the Spanish used to, but we haven't really mapped it. We don't know what's out there. We haven't explored the full extent of our own territorial possessions. So that frightened a lot of people. We kind of saw that in Edgar Huntley, right? The frontier's scary. What are we going to do with all of this new land that we haven't explored yet? We're going to have to go out there. We're going to need guys like Leatherstocking to blaze the trails and fight the Indians and make it safe for us. And it's all very scary. It's very violent. So there was a lot of ambiguity. There was a lot of ambivalence towards future expansion. Some Americans didn't necessarily support it. In some cases, at least in part, because of Native Americans. But in other cases, they just, didn't want to be subjected to violence and instability. So this Indian question was very relevant throughout the 1820s. And again, going back to the eastern seaboard, right? By the 1820s, most Native Americans along the Atlantic coast had already been defeated militarily, and they had been dispossessed of their land, either through unfair treaties or just sheer force. So, but many of them remained. Many of them were living on sort of early versions of reservations. Some attempted to assimilate, moved to cities, learned English, obviously, tried to, get jobs and sort of live according to these new European-based standards. So they were still there, and there were still questions about land ownership. There were still a lot of legal things to be worked out. So this was an ongoing debate that, again, Sedgwick is participating in here because she's arguing for the humanity of Native Americans. And I think for modern audiences, that can be a difficult thing to appreciate because nowadays we recognize, I think for the most people recognize the humanity of all groups, regardless of skin color and background. But again, we have to remember that that simply was not the case in the early 19th century. So one of the big rhetorical strategies on display in Hope Leslie, one of the reasons Magawiska is made to appear heroic, virtuous, is because Sedgwick wants to make this argument that, hey, Native Americans can possess a lot of the same good qualities that white people have. They're not all that different from us. Now, of course, that depends on circumstances. There are some Native characters that are not really depicted very favorably in the book, but certain characters, the ones that are kind of created as almost parallel sort of versions to white characters, or they're at least shown to possess some of the same qualities as white characters, those Native Americans are good. Those Native Americans are meant to be sympathized with and maybe even related to on a certain level. But the larger argument is essentially, hey, they deserve respect. They deserve to have a chance to live and prosper, and they are not all that different from us. So ultimately, the Indian question, though, would sort of get resolved in the form of the Indian Removal Act of 1830. So some of you might have learned about this earlier in school. When Andrew Jackson was president, he authorized this really kind of sweeping measure to basically remove the remaining Native Americans from the East, largely from the Southeast, to remove them and make them relocate to what was then called Indian Territory. It was the modern-day state of Oklahoma, along with parts of modern-day Arkansas. And basically all of the major tribes in the Southeast, the Cherokees, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creeks, the Seminoles, many of them probably descendants of some of the groups that Cabeza de Vaca encountered back in the 1500s, all of those tribes were forced to relocate. And by and large, they did. I mean, some of them stayed behind, some of them defied the orders, but by and large, a lot of them moved west. And by that point, a lot of the tribes in New England had already relocated. A lot of them had already gone further west to find more hospitable living conditions. So that's all going on during the era of Hope Leslie. I mean, the actual era in which it's written and released and received and reviewed. So again, she's going back to an older, Sedgwick is going back to an older period in our history, but a lot of what she's doing resonates in the 1820s. It resonates at her present moment, even though she's exploring, the early 1600s. She's very interested in what's happening 200 years later throughout the eastern U.S. The Indian question, what are we going to do with these large populations that either need to be assimilated into mainstream American culture or they need to be sort of put aside so they're no longer a hindrance to mainstream American culture. That's how a lot of people would have framed it and understood it back then. But of course, this was a time of great depredation, great tragedy, and great loss of life, loss of land, loss of tradition for a lot of these Native American groups. So it was a political question for a lot of white people, but of course, for the Native Americans, it was often, a life or death kind of thing. But even to this day, there are many people of Native American descent in Oklahoma. Many of them belong to those tribes that were traditionally in the Southeast. And in fact, you can find a lot of instances of tribes that are now based in Midwestern states or further to the west, but if you read the history, they originated in the eastern part of the U.S. The Delawares are actually a good example. A lot of them went west. If you remember, the Delawares were in Edgar Huntley. A lot of them went west. If you ever read Cormac McCarthy, a great Western writer, a more contemporary Western writer, and a lot of his fiction, some of the outlaws and kind of rough and tumble guys, they'll be hanging with Delawares. So some of the Delawares have gone west where they can find freedom and land and some opportunities, the Old West, as it was back in the sort of mid to late 1800s. So that's happening. That's been happening for decades. And that will continue to happen. But it becomes a formal government policy in 1830. Again, it wasn't just, hey, you can go if you want to. It was a forced removal. And that happens just a few years after Hope Leslie is published. Okay, so I just wanted to add a little bit of more cultural context there. So if we look at Hope Leslie and we think about some of the voices that we hear, and we think about the overall narrative structure, I think we'll find that, again, it's very interesting. It's a little bit ambiguous, perhaps, in some ways. So one thing that Sedgwick does is she allows Native Americans at times to tell their own stories of massacres suffered at the hands of white characters. So by doing that, she's kind of undermining, or, at the hands of white settlers. They're not exactly characters necessarily in this book. But again, referencing real life massacres, actual events from history. In the process, Sedgwick is kind of undermining a lot of the older Puritan historians who probably would not have really talked about those massacres, or they would have spun them in a different way. They would have made it seem like, the whites were actually, in danger, and, the white people were not provoking, and they were just, defending themselves or whatever. So Sedgwick is kind of offering an alternate history, in many ways a more accurate history of some of these early white Indian relations in New England. But remember, she's not all the way on the side of social reform. She's not exactly trying to stir the pot too much. So even though she does give a voice, at least to Magawiska, she also, at times, her narrator will sort of insert some facts and some commentary at key points to justify some of the Puritans' actions. But it is important to note that Sedgwick is willing to at least gently criticize her Puritan ancestors at times. And she will point out that Puritans often misunderstood the local Native American groups like the Pequots. They often misunderstood the native customs and cultures and religious practices even. And Sedgwick even offers some specific examples of that. So she's acknowledging that the Puritans were often wrong. They were often ignorant about this new country, the new people that they were encountering. And of course, from our modern perspective, we're like, well, yeah, of course they were. Of course we know that they were wrong, that they misapprehended a lot, that they were very prejudiced as far as the way they viewed natives. They viewed natives as inferior because they were not Christian, because they did not practice the kinds of customs and traditions that the Puritans would have been used to. We know that. But for Sedgwick's time period, it is pretty noteworthy that she's acknowledging that she's pointing to some of the mistakes made by the Puritans, some of the things they did wrong, some of the things they got wrong. So that's kind of important. But yeah, there are limitations because most of our Puritan characters, certainly Hope and Everell and, William Fletcher, they're all very morally upright. So is John Winthrop. We do meet him. He's kind of stern and severe, but he likes Hope. He's still presented as a virtuous, admirable character. But she is willing to borrow some different parts of culture. She's willing to put a little bit of a different spin on a lot of Puritan and New England history. And again, Hope as a character is sort of this representation of like America's potential, America's promise, the possibilities of a new nation, a free nation, a place where people can come to be free. That's why William Fletcher comes over, right? And Hope represents what we can be. She's this female version of that Leatherstocking character type that I mentioned before. And again, with Leatherstocking, it was always important to remember that he could embody the best traits of Native Americans while remaining racially pure. And that's something that Leatherstocking reminds people of. Hey, I'm a Christian. I'm still a Christian, even though I live out here with Indians. I'm still white. I'm still a Christian. That gets emphasized, particularly in Last of the Mohicans. right? So Hope kind of functions in a similar way. She admires Native Americans. She sympathizes with Native Americans. She works on their behalf at times. She understands them in a way that a lot of her Puritan peers do not. But she remains clearly white, clearly Christian. She never completely rejects her own society, her own Puritan community. She is sometimes disapproved of by them. They do find fault with her at times because she's headstrong, because she's kind of stubborn. She's a little bit more independent than women would have been expected to be at that time period. And Sedgwick shows that, and she shows some authority figures like Winthrop, and at times even Esther and others kind of try to rein Hope in a little bit, and they're like, "Hey, you're kind of going too far. You're asserting yourself a little bit too much, considering your social station as a young unmarried woman." But Sedgwick wants us to understand that there's no moral defect with Hope, okay? Her biggest crimes are just being really passionate and, again, maybe a bit stubborn, not always listening to good advice. So, yeah, she might be perceived, and probably would have been perceived at the time, as maybe blundering a little bit or like maybe trespassing certain social codes. But, again, from the perch of the 1820s, a lot of readers would have looked back at the early 1600s and said, okay, well, that was an earlier time. They were kind of old-fashioned. So Hope is almost like a modern character. Like maybe she would have fit in even better 200 years later when our culture had kind of progressed and modernized a little bit more, and women had at least a little, I would emphasize a little, more freedom than they probably had 200 years prior. But there's a critic named Caroline Karcher who's done a lot of good work both with Sedgwick and some other early frontier romance writers. And she makes the claim that Hope Leslie really stands out amongst its other sort of contemporaries because it's multivocal, which just means it has a lot of different voices. And it's also kind of technically innovative compared to other 19th century frontier romances. So she talks about this idea of it being dialogic. I don't know if you guys know that term. It's used a lot in literary criticism. Dialogic just means kind of like dialogue, multiple voices. If we just have one voice, right, that's a monologue. That's just one person talking. But when we have dialogue, we're hearing from multiple people. It's a conversation. We hear multiple voices. So that's what a dialogic work of fiction is. It just means we hear a lot of different voices. We might still have a narrator or a first-person narrator who kind of guides us through the story, but we're going to hear from other characters, and we might even hear certain events presented to us in the words, in the voice of other characters. So, and Karcher and other critics think that sort of style, having multiple voices, providing multiple perspectives, is really important to Sedgwick because she is both questioning and reinforcing some of America's most dominant myths about the way our country was created, the way the wilderness was tamed, the way Puritan settlers interacted with Native Americans. So again, she doesn't want to blow the whole thing up. She still admires a lot of these early Puritans. She wants to celebrate early Puritan history in New England, but she's also cognizant of the fact that Native Americans play an essential role. They can't be left out. They can't be neglected. They are a part of the history. They are a part of the mythology. So she's very insistent on that while also reinforcing the ultimate goodness of the Puritan colonizing project in New England. So she kind of draws a little bit of attention to this in her preface. The preface to the edition of the novel that I ordered. I hope it's the one you guys have, but I think that preface will probably appear no matter what edition you have. But there, Sedgwick is kind of making a call for equality. and she's justifying the character of Magawiska by sort of, again, ultimately she's going to compare her to Hope, at least implicitly, right? She's telling us that, Native Americans can have these noble qualities as well. They can be admirable. And ultimately, the message is a little bit like maybe we can assimilate them, at least the noble ones like Magawiska, the ones with good qualities, because they are somewhat similar to us. But she also mentions in the preface that she wants to spark an interest among young people in U.S. history, which I always find kind of interesting because, again, the 1820s, very early days of our nation, but already there's this nostalgia for the colonial times. There's a nostalgia for the older times that maybe people coming along now in the 1820s don't know as much about. People in the 1820s don't know as much about the Puritan history of New England or the French Indian War in New York. So that's where frontier romance writers like Cooper, like Sedgwick, that's where they kind of come in. There's a lot of history. You can learn things from these novels, but they're also adventure stories. They're designed to be entertaining. They're designed to play with these regional characteristics, and also they're designed to kind of create a mythology all our own, using our landscape, our history, uniquely American character types like Leatherstocking. Again, you're not going to find a Leatherstocking in England. He's a uniquely American type. And I think we could argue the same is true with Hope. She is a distinctly American creation. So again, she kind of represents larger things. She represents larger qualities or even ideals connected to the nation that we can probably track and think more about. Okay, give me one moment. I left some of my notes over on a different table. So, I don't want to do a lot of plot summary here. There is a lot happening in this novel. It can get a little bit convoluted, but I want to start with some things that we see in the beginning that might seem a little unfamiliar to us, but they would have been familiar to readers in the 1820s. So, we start at the beginning of the novel with Everill's father, William, and his early life in England. So a little bit like Bradstreet, right? We can go back to the early days in England before coming over as part of these early colonizing efforts in New England. But one thing we're meant to understand, I just wanted to mention this, we're meant to understand the basic difference between the Royalist Church of England and liberty-loving Puritans. So I kind of mentioned this when I was talking about Puritans back in week 4. They were dissenters from the Church of England. So they were kind of, marginalized and discriminated against in England because they had different religious practices. So that was a big reason why they came over to the future U.S. in the first place. So in this particular version of history, the Royalists, the Church of England who support the monarch of England, they're cast in a very negative light for the most part. They're kind of villainous and duplicitous. And later when we meet Sir Philip Gardner, again, he's kind of a representative of that group, and or Gardnier, I think it's like vaguely French. So we're not supposed to trust him because he's Catholic and he's a royalist and he's not a good guy. So very slanted version of history, as you might expect, since Sedgwick descends from these early Puritan settlers. But in her version, the Puritans loved liberty and they wanted, the chance to live their own lives and pursue their own interests, and they couldn't really do that in England. And that problem is exemplified by the fact that William is denied a chance to be with his love, his sort of first love, who's Alice. So that relationship gets severed by the dastardly royalists, and as a result, William decides to start a new life in New England. He comes over in that part of that 1630 voyage. So again, this conflict that was going on in England between the royalists who supported the monarchy and parliamentarians, many of whom were Puritans, not all of them, but they were basically opposed to the monarchy, and they supported, a parliamentary style government, which is more of like what you see now. And that eventually led to the English Civil War, which broke out in the 1640s and 1650s. We don't have to know a lot about that. That's England's history, of course, but we're getting a little bit of that cultural history at the beginning of this novel because, of course, the Puritans, their origins were largely in England. So William and people like him, they would have been more aligned with the parliamentarians. They were against the sort of, autocratic, absolute monarchy style of government. But again, notice how we have a lot of American stuff embedded in this older English history. The way Sedgwick wants us to understand it is that these Puritans were coming over to seek freedom and a chance to have a new way of life, which is largely based on their own writings and what we know about them, but it's also a very American narrative, right? They're coming to undergo a process of remaking, self-making, remaking the self, starting a new life, free from old world prejudice, free from old world systems of government. Again, their support of a parliamentary style government is very important because that shows that they already have the impulse towards democracy and equality that will ultimately give rise to American style government, which is, of course, really a response to the shortcomings of monarchies. So that's all embedded in the early stages of the plot. Just kind of be aware of that. So by 1636, William Fletcher has joined the new community of Springfield on the Connecticut River that's in modern-day southwestern Massachusetts. I'm pretty sure that's the modern-day Springfield, which still exists in western Massachusetts. I actually had a friend who was from Springfield when I was growing up. So he had moved down south when he was young. But so it's still there, right? So we're really getting specific with our geography. And again, we're borrowing real parts of this older colonial history. So William is a very magnanimous, kind soul. He eventually marries and starts a family, though remember, he's denied his love with Alice because of those bad royalists, those Church of England guys back in England. But he later marries, starts a family, and then he takes 2 Pequot children into his household at the end of that war that I mentioned before. So he takes in Magawiska and her brother Aneko, who both become sort of friends. They kind of grow up alongside William's own son, Everil. So these relationships matter. Magawiska and Everil are close. They're not romantic, and that's kind of important to note. At least through the first 7 chapters, we get the feeling that maybe they could pursue a romantic relationship, but they don't. Instead, it's just a really solid friendship based on mutual respect. And again, they view themselves largely, they view one another largely as equals. So that's significant as well. And around this same time, Hope also comes into the Fletcher household. So this is complicated, but just be clear about this. She's the daughter of William's former lover, Alice, because they were separated. Alice ends up marrying some soldier with the last name of Leslie, but then he dies, and then Alice dies, or she dies on the voyage over to the New World, then the soldier dies. I don't know. But ultimately, Hope, along with her sister, Faith, they are both orphaned. And they are brought into the Fletcher household. So Hope grows up with Everil, with Magawiska, with her own natural sister as well. So this kind of a big mixed family, which almost kind of reminds me of some of our modern day rom-coms where we have these different kind of unconventional families with all different kinds of people, and it's sometimes difficult, but we all love each other and we learn a lot in the process. So we have a couple of Native American kids, we have William's own kid, and then we have Hope and her sister who were the products of a different union. So kind of interesting. That's our basic domestic setup at the beginning of the novel. And we have a few supporting characters as well, like Mrs. Grafton, the tutor that lives with the family, Master Craddock. Those two characters are really largely comic relief. They're largely there to make us laugh, and they're kind of silly. But also, Mrs. Grafton is not a Puritan. That's kind of important. Like, she comes from a different sort of cultural background. And she's not a Puritan. She's not a parliamentarian. She likes the king. She likes nice things. I think she might have been an Anglican, a member of the Church of England. So she represents a slightly different cultural background. And that is kind of important to observe. But through the first several chapters, we live in this kind of tranquil but bustling domestic scene. And we also have another Native American character, Nalima, who's later suspected of being a witch. She's kind of a domestic. She's kind of a servant for the family. But Hope kind of forms a relationship with her. Hope comes to kind of admire her and takes a little bit of an interest in her, and also sort of operates on her behalf later when Nalima is wrongfully accused of witchcraft and imprisoned by the bigoted Puritan power structure that rules this colony. Also, an interesting thing, if we're talking about these multiple voices, if you look at chapter 4, we get a passage where we're actually hearing about the Pequot War from Magawiska. We're actually getting her narration. She doesn't tell much of the story herself, but she does recap several events from the Pequot War. So again, this is what critics mean when they talk about the book being innovative and featuring a lot of different voices and perspectives. Because again, in the 1820s, it would not have been very common to allow Native Americans to tell the story of white Indian conflict, right? That was something reserved for white historians, white storytellers, white novelists. But here, Magawiska gets to tell the story, and she's telling it from the Pequot perspective. So Sedgwick's, she's willing to acknowledge that the Puritan settlers did some stuff wrong, and the Pequot suffered. And just by acknowledging those facts, which seem pretty hard to deny to most modern people, just by acknowledging them, and by allowing a Native American female character to have her own voice and to have her own platform, that is different for the time period. That is moving us forward in a lot of ways. But then in chapter 5, we have some violence erupting between this sort of Pequot band and local white settlers. So it's the father of Magawiska, Mononoto, or whatever his name is. He's leading a group of survivors who have survived the war. And they go on this raid. They end up killing much of the Fletcher family. That includes William's wife. His daughters, I believe, are also killed. And then in the process, Hope's sister, Faith, she's taken prisoner. And Magawiska and her brother, Oneko, are sort of reclaimed by their own Pequot kin. So that's a very important event, violent, frightening. We have that tranquility of our early chapters very abruptly disrupted. And it's a reminder, something that Brown wanted us to know as well. It's a reminder that life on the frontier is very unpredictable. That violence can happen at any time. That stability is often in short supply. And, that's part of the danger. That's part of the fear. That things are very unstable and things can change at a moment's notice. So we have a lot of dramatic scenes in this novel. One of the most famous ones occurs in chapter 7. So Everill, that's right, Everill gets taken prisoner as well, right? Everill gets seized along with Faith. So he's being held prisoner by Monoto and this sort of renegade Pequot band who are kind of seeking revenge for some of the things that happened during the war. So again, somewhat similar to what we see from the Delawares and Edgar Huntley. right? They've lost the war, they've lost their land, but some of them have stayed behind and they're continuing to sort of make trouble for the English colonists, and there is vengeance at work. But we noticed in Edgar Huntley that the vengeance goes both ways, right? There's been a lot of bloodshed. There's been a lot of violence. So we have Native Americans seeking vengeance on whites, and we also have whites seeking vengeance on Native Americans. This violent cycle that Brown showed us in Edgar Huntley. So a little bit similar here. And Everill's taken hostage, and it looks like they are going to, sacrifice him, kill him, and Magawiska steps in, risks her own life, and ultimately ends up losing an arm in the process of saving Everill from her own father and, his orders. So if you're familiar with the Pocahontas legend, I mentioned this briefly back when we were talking about John Smith in whatever that was, week 3. If you know a little bit about that legend, this particular scene from Hope Leslie might remind you of that of the Pocahontas legend, because supposedly in a lot of the popular retellings of that story, something very similar transpired with Pocahontas and John Smith. So he was taken prisoner by the Powhatan Confederation that was powerful in Virginia in the early 1600s. He's taken prisoner. We don't really know what they were going to do to him. Smith seemed to think that they were going to sacrifice him in some kind of ritual, some kind of ceremony, but a lot of historians claim that he probably misunderstood what was going on. It was probably some kind of symbolic ritual where they maybe weren't actually going to do anything to him, but he misunderstood, he freaked out, he thought his life was in danger. But the traditional telling of the story goes that Pocahontas saved him, that she stepped in and prevented her father from killing him. So that's a very similar thing to what we see here, except Magawiska and Everill are not an item. They are not romantically involved. They're just really good friends. That's a really good friend that you would be willing to lose an arm for. So this is a kind of familiar thing that gets rehearsed in a lot of American fiction and pop culture. And I think from our modern perspective, it might make us a little bit queasy to think about a Native American woman, and it is often women who are being asked to make this kind of sacrifice in these works of fiction. It's the ultimate act of self-sacrifice, to throw yourself in front of the blade in an effort to save who? A white man. In the case of John Smith and in the case of Everill. Everill's not quite the scoundrel that John Smith really was, but we notice the same tendency, right? The Native American woman must sacrifice herself, or at least be willing to sacrifice herself to save the white man. So we don't necessarily feel the same way about that narrative today, perhaps in 2022, but we should recognize that for a long time, that kind of narrative, those kinds of notes and beats were very popular, very dominant in our culture. So we see them here. But again, we have to understand that Magawiska's heroism and her sacrifice, her selflessness, they're all designed as kind of part of Sedgwick's rhetorical strategy to argue for the inherent humanity of Native Americans, which was still often denied by white politicians and other people in positions of power. So Sedgwick, again, wants to show us that, hey, Magawiska is a good person. She's noble. She's virtuous. She can live with white people. She's cut out for life in our modern day American society. It's very much part of that argument. I find some of the selflessness and heroism on display to be a little bit tiresome at times, just to my modern perspective, but it's all very much part of this larger rhetorical strategy. But again, we can keep finding sort of, even though that particular episode's pretty typical for a lot of frontier romances, we can find other cool stuff that's unique. So if you move ahead to chapter 8, still in volume 1, Again, you'll find another example of what Caroline Karcher means when she says this book is dialogic. It has a lot of different voices in conversation. So at the beginning of chapter 8, we get a letter from Hope to Everil, who at this point is residing in England with like the family of his mother, I think. It can be hard to keep track of all the details, but he's back in England basically getting an education because we're so early in American history. We don't have a lot of civic institutions or schools yet, so he kind of has to go back over to England to finish his training, and then he'll come back home when he's ready to start life as a sort of well-born gentleman, at least as much of that as we had in the early American colonial project. So again, Everil is the classic romantic sort of romance adventure hero. He's well-born, good-looking, educated, cultured, but also kind of tolerant. He has a sense of humor. That's a little bit of the interesting part about the character. When he comes back from England, he's been exposed to a non-Puritan way of life. He likes art a little bit. Like, he's sometimes criticized by other Puritans back in Massachusetts for maybe being a little bit too liberal, a little bit too, progressive or modern for their tastes. Again, he seems pretty mild, I think, to us, but compared to a lot of his Puritan peers, yeah, he had seen more of the world. He was a little bit more open-minded about other people, other practices. So we're supposed to notice that, I think, as readers, and we're supposed to regard Everil as a really good stand-up guy. But he's not our primary hero. He sometimes functions as a hero. He does some good heroic stuff, but he's often taking a back seat to Hope. And keep in mind, it's Magawiska who saves him. Not Everil saving her. So some of the agency, some of the activity often given to the male heroes, the male leads, in this novel, they get shifted over to the female leads. And Everil has a little bit less to do than a typical romance hero. He's still a very important character. But again, he, in a more traditional romance, the focus would be on him. And Hope and Magawiska and Esther, they'd all be smaller roles, supporting roles. So Sedgwick is doing something different in that regard. So that chapter from Hope to Everil, again, we're getting Hope's voice. In chapter 8, that letter that we see at the beginning of the chapter, we're getting Hope's voice. And she's telling a story to Everil about Nalima and about Native American spirituality and medicine. And she's also commenting on the prejudice of the Puritans who don't understand Native American medicine, don't understand Native American belief systems. So they just immediately say witchcraft, evil, Satan, no good. And Hope isn't with that. Hope as a character, she's still pretty loyal to her people, but she's not with that kind of prejudiced viewpoint. She rejects it. And she encounters a little bit of difficulty as a result. So again, we're getting Hope's voice, and we're getting a pretty interesting take on Native American culture, and even a sort of tacit admission, maybe even pretty overt, that the Puritans were wrong about things, and they often were prejudiced and closed-minded in their dealings with local Native Americans. So you would not have gotten a chapter like that from James Fenimore Cooper. You're not going to hear from women in James Fenimore Cooper unless they're just talking to men or doing things for men. And you certainly weren't going to get a chapter that sort of casts some aspersions on the white settlers. That's not what most frontier romancers were doing. And it is something that Sedgwick is doing. But I want to mention, though, I want to compare her briefly to another writer of frontier romances, Lydia Maria Child, who I mentioned earlier. We are going to read her later. We're not going to read this book, but this is probably Child's most famous work of fiction. She was also a journalist. But this book is called Hobomoke, and it came out, I want to say, in 1824, maybe, the same general period as Last of the Mohicans and Hope Leslie. But what's interesting about Hobomoke is it has a more clear sort of political message about the mistreatment received by Native Americans, and there's even an interracial romance between a Native American man and a white woman. So Child is often thought of as a real social reformer, like somebody who really did push for equal rights for women, or at least more rights for women. She was an outspoken advocate for Native Americans. I mean, she herself was a white woman, just like Sedgwick, from New England, I think, just like Sedgwick, but she advocated for Native Americans. She wrote quite a bit about Native Americans, and she wasn't shy, Child wasn't, about criticizing certain aspects of white culture and our own history and what we had done to a lot of these tribes. So they're different in that Child was a more outspoken social commentator, and Sedgwick really was not. So Sedgwick did not really speak up about political issues, and like I said earlier, she would not have identified as even an early version of a feminist, but she is pushing for us to recognize Native Americans as human, as possessing decent qualities, good qualities oftentimes. So she is still pushing for a vision of equality. And again, her character Hope embodies what could be if we can put aside some of our prejudices, if we can find some kind of harmonious middle ground. Again, we, for Sedgwick, again, of course, being white people, if we can put aside some of the darker chapters of our own history, if we can acknowledge a little bit of wrongdoing, if we can come to a little bit more of an appreciation for certain aspects of Native American culture, then there's kind of this middle road that Hope represents, right? Where you can borrow a little bit from different cultures. You can modify, moderate some of the harsher qualities of old Puritan New England and maybe find a new path forward where, again, women are playing a central role. Native Americans get to play a central role. Again, it's dialogic. It's multi-voiced. It's not just the white men running everything. And again, I just want you to kind of notice the times where we see Hope defying sort of traditional power structures. We see her rebelling against some of the authority figures in her community. So if you jump ahead to Volume 2, for example, at the very beginning of Volume 2, in Chapter 1, of Volume 2, you see her that, she's kind of rebelling against Governor Winthrop at times. She rebels against certain aspects of sort of popularly held notions, some of the traditional standards and conventions of that time and place. So we see that, and again, we're supposed to, I think, as readers, notice it, maybe admire it. Again, Hope is a little bit rebellious. She's a little bit headstrong. She's never morally suspect, but she can be a little undiplomatic, and she often recognizes that she's right, and a lot of men who have more power than her are not right. So just by showing that alone, we are getting a bit of a new perspective, at least considering, our time period. But yeah, while we're in the early part of Volume 2, I wanted to point out a few other passages that I think you guys should look at. In Chapter 2, I believe this is around page 204, you can find a great example of Sedgwick sort of threading the needle between gently correcting previous white histories of colonization, but also sort of reaffirming European supremacy. Because again, for Sedgwick and a lot of even sort of liberal thinkers of that time period, the best way forward for Native Americans was some form of assimilation, adopting a lot of aspects of European or European-based American culture. And even like Cabeza de Vaca, if we go back to the beginning, a lot of what they would say in defense of their native friends would be, hey, they would convert, they would be able to live with us. They would adopt our ways of life. They would practice our religion. They're amenable to making some of those changes. That was a big part of how Cabeza de Vaca and even Sedgwick would sort of advocate on behalf of the Native Americans. They can adapt to our culture, so let's give them a chance to try. Which again, that still doesn't make us always feel great, because assimilation's not always great for the party being forced to assimilate and lose a lot of their original culture. But again, Sedgwick's no reformer, right? So she wants us to, appreciate the supremacy of white culture while also appreciating the best qualities of Native American culture. Another good example of her doing that is in chapter 7 of volume 2, around page 276. If you want to look at those. So we'll notice that in volume 2, we have a lot of what we might call like romantic intrigue, which might not always be super interesting to readers. But keep in mind, Everill and Hope are in love, despite kind of growing up like brother and sister. But remember, they're not actually related. Okay, so it's okay. They're not actually brother and sister. But so they're in love, but it's not out in the open yet. Esther, who we meet a little bit later in the novel, once Hope gets removed to Boston. So remember, she's wild enough, rebellious enough for William to basically say, hey, I can't contain her. She needs to go to Boston and live in John Winthrop's household. And that's where we meet Esther. And Esther is in love with Everill, and Hope thinks that Everill is in love with Esther. And eventually, Hope announces that Everill and Esther are together, even though they're kind of not. Like, Everill's kind of ambiguous about it because ultimately he wants to be with Hope, and eventually Hope figures it out. I mean, you could take that plot and put it in a 2015 rom-com and it would still kind of work, right? The misunderstandings, the sort of awkward moments when one character comes to some kind of important discovery. It's all kind of recognizable, I think, for a modern audience. But we need to remember that a lot of these kinds of plot developments would have been commonly found in a lot of sentimental fiction of the 1700s and 1800s. So let's not completely forget about sentimental novels. We talked about those in relation to The Coquette. This is a very different book, of course, and it's primarily classified as a frontier romance, first and foremost, but Sedgwick is borrowing some elements from classic sentimental fiction when it comes to some of our domestic scenes, when it comes to some of the relationship-related plot developments. We are borrowing a little bit from sentimental tropes. Again, the sort of sudden, improbable turns of events, misunderstandings, lots of kind of improbable things happening. That's all going to be pretty common in sentimental fiction. Also, really playing heavily on readers' emotions, making us feel sympathy for certain characters, making us feel, frightened for characters, making us dislike other characters like the dastardly Gardenier. That's all kind of similar to what we would have seen in popular sentimental fiction. But the primary focus here is on the frontier romance stuff. So we get back to that pretty quickly as we progress, in volume 2. I just want to say a word about Sir Philip, because if you feel like he seems like a character that kind of walked in from a different novel, that's actually kind of true. I mean, a lot of critics have pointed out that Sir Philip Gardenier is almost like a villain from a chivalric romance. Like, he's almost really kind of a representative of an older literary tradition. He's kind of a debauched royalist who's there in disguise. He's trying to seduce Hope. He doesn't really have a lot of success. But he does give off the mistaken impression that the two of them are together. Of course, that's not really true. But just that whole character type, right? He's like aristocratic, but in a bad way. Like he's dissolute, kind of like Sanford. He's a rake. He's just pursuing pleasure. He doesn't have a moral compass. But again, in this novel, he represents kind of the royalist faction of England, that was very hostile to the Puritans. So he's still trying to get their goat, over in the New World. So he kind of feels like a character from an older era of literature. But he shows up largely to kind of drive certain plot mechanisms. A lot goes on. A lot of kidnappings. You might notice that Hope is taken prisoner on multiple occasions. We have a lot of kidnapping. It's almost like a motif that runs throughout the novel, and that is important because I've mentioned Indian captivity narratives as another popular literary genre in the early days of America. So we mentioned Mary Rowlandson and some other examples of captivity narratives. Even Cabeza de Vaca at times is giving us some of that in his narrative. Well, we get that here as well. Lots of hostage taking, lots of kidnappings, and then later escapes. That's where a lot of the action and dramatic tension can come from. I mean, ultimately, she's captured by Gardinier and that Chaddock guy and his debauched crew of sailors. and then, a ship explodes. I mean, there's a lot of action. And I would say that, we can note Sedgwick's talent for pacing and action. The plot might be improbable, which of course is true of a lot of romances. It might have been improbable and melodramatic, but it's rarely boring. A lot happens. The plot can rarely be described as boring. But again, focus on the trials and tribulations of our three heroines. Obviously, Hope, first and foremost, but also Magawiska and Esther. Just keep your eye on those three characters and how they sort of serve as moral authorities and our, they're often our lens. They provide a lens into this world, this particular chapter of our colonial history. So ultimately, we get a happy ending. I want you to notice what Esther does at the end. Sort of the choices she makes after she's, her love for Everil kind of, amounts to naught. But notice the choices she makes. She kind of chooses an unconventional path for a woman in colonial America. We can continue to notice the elements of frontier romance and also some of that older domestic sentimental fiction stuff that we've already talked about. All of that does sort of work here, but first and foremost, it is an important frontier romance that would give rise to a lot of other frontier romances, and we can continue to track that sort of story, that sort of literature, all the way up to present day. So again, think about Hope as maybe a symbol or a representation of what America could be. Think about the ways that Hope and Magawiska are very similar and kind of parallel to one another. So can we sort of take aspects of both characters? Can we meld them? Can we combine them? Are we thinking or looking at transculturation? Are we looking at a hybridized culture emerging out of these violent early encounters between white settlers and Native Americans? Just a final thought about another frontier romance. Susanna Rowson, who wrote Charlotte Temple, also wrote a very early frontier romance just 1 year before Edgar Huntley was published. Her book is called Reuben and Rachel. It was not super popular at the time, Rowson's frontier romance, but it's also set in old New England. And it's really weird, and it's really about this combining of white culture, Native American culture, even aspects of like South American culture. It's weird. And critics even have kind of decided now that part of the reason the book wasn't successful in its time at the end of the 1790s is because Ralston's presenting this really multicultural, diverse vision of what America could be with a lot of interracial marriage and a lot of mixing of blood, and American audiences weren't quite ready for that at the end of the 1790s, but also the frontier romance as we know it had not been really codified or standardized yet at the end of the 18th century. So I mentioned that with Edgar Huntley. Writers like Brown and Ralston were helping to create the frontier romance, but it's not until Cooper and Child and Sedgwick come along about 20 or 30 years later that the genre really flourishes. So that's kind of important to keep in mind. Like, we can't go too far with the racial mixing and the diverse future path of America, not at this point in history. So Sedgwick pulls back a little bit. We don't have interracial romance, at least not good ones. The one we do see seems to have negative consequences ultimately, but Sedgwick wants us to acknowledge the humanity of Native Americans. Maybe let's not remove them in such a violent, abrupt way like we actually did, and let's find some kind of middle path where maybe we can share culture, we can live in harmony, but precedence is often granted to the white side of the equation. Okay, so I hope you guys enjoy this book. I hope you find some interesting stuff to talk about with our heroines. Think about telling history through the eyes of women, particularly a Native American woman. And do your best. If you're still working on the novel next week, that's fine. As I've mentioned, next week it's a little bit lighter, so we're going to read Washington Irving, one short story from him, and a couple of short stories from Nathaniel Hawthorne as we continue to move up through the 1820s into the 1830s. So I'll see you next week.